Alright, so I thought I'd go over a video on the movements of the body. This will help you understand certain movements of muscles and maybe improve your ability to pass the NASM certification test. But also, if you're geeking out about anatomy and would like a refresher, this could be something that can be useful for you as a kind of visual tool, because we are all visual learners. So let's kind of I'm just going to go over the top of my head here. Flexion, extension. So this is neck flexion and extension, right? This is lateral flexion of the neck, right? Lateral flexion of the spine. Then we have supination. I remember this by like carrying a bowl of soup. This is how I remember that. This is pronation, supination, pronation. Now looking at my shoulder here, we have internal rotation. Now typically when I internally rotate my arm, my shoulder, typically what happens to my palm, it also pronates as well. Then we do external rotation at the shoulder. What happens to the palm? It supinates. So at the palm here, I'm getting confused now. Pronation, supination. This is carrying some soup in my hand. A cup of soup, right? And then we talk about working our chest, working our pecs. We have adduction. Just a shoulder, adduction. Arms coming towards the midline. Anything coming towards the midline is going to always be adduction. Abduction, or abduction, which can easily be confused. It's just abduction is just moving away from the midline. And a lot of people, well, I think a lot of reasons why you might hear someone just say abduction and not abduction, because abduction is a way to kind of enunciate it better, so that you're clear with what you're saying, and also kind of helps just helps you remember what you're talking about. Because when you talk about all these movement patterns, sometimes it can easily be confused. You can easily get confused. So, abduction. Now, what's abduction? Think about some movements that cause abduction or that work abduction. I'll turn around. Our rear delts, right? Rear delts, abduction. So, typically, and then we got, what's this here? Moving away from the midline, right? So this is abduction, coming in, adduction, adduction, adduction. Typically, almost all horizontal adduction is working the chest. Now, looking at the shoulder again, this is kind of where things get a little confusing. Just kind of going over the movements is shoulder flexion. Now, one way to remember shoulder flexion, or anything that has the word flex in it or the word F in it, flexion, is typically moving forward. So typically, if I'm doing flexion, my arms are moving forward, flexion, knee's going up, flexion. You know, the only difference is the knee. So the knee is backwards. So anything that's moving in front of your body is typically flexion, not always. The only difference, I think the only one that you could really remember is the knee, or it's the opposite. Because then if you kick your leg forward, this is knee extension, and then if you bend your leg like this is knee flexion. So then we have hip flexion, hip extension. What works the extensors of the hip? Extensors of the hip are what? Think the powerful hip extender. Think about the most strongest, most powerful part of your body. And that is your butt muscle, your glutes and hamstrings. The posterior chain you may hear. Hip extension, right? Hip flexion when the hip goes up. Then knee extension, flexion. This is when the knee bends in. And if I bring my leg back, this is extension. So there's kind of two different ways to look at extension of the hip. You can extend like this, like a lot of girls will have a cable to their ankle, and they'll do hip extension like this. Sometimes what they'll do also is if they do like a RDL, like I'm on one leg here, coming down, and then I'm coming up, right, having to use extension. Also a deadlift, extension. What else is there? Now let's look at the feet. Let me scoot back here a little bit. I don't have enough space. But I want you to see my feet, because the feet can be kind of hard to remember or easy to forget. So on the ground here, look at my feet. I'm wearing Olympic shoes, but so as my knees flex forward, what's happening to my ankle? This is called, I always have to dorsiflexion, right? Dorsiflexion. When the toe is coming up towards the knee, that's dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion. And then when I do come up like this into my doing a calf raise, look at these calves. Okay, so this is plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. All right. Now, hip external rotation, or knee abduction, right? How do you remember this? moving away from the midline is abduction. Also, keep in mind that the femur bone, I mean, when they do assessments in NASM, they'll say knees adduct or abduct. Keep in mind that usually that means internal or external rotation of the hip. Because if you look at the hip here, external rotation of the hip, the knee, moving away from the midline, they're rotating out like this, right? And then adducting, coming inwards like so. That's typically not just adduction, but it's also internal rotation. The femur is wanting to rotate in. So as I squat down here to the bottom, I'm going into hip external rotation, piriformis, right? I'm getting into dorsiflexion because I'm closing the gap here where my shoelaces are. And then I'm also going to hip flexion where I'm bending right here. And I get here to the bottom, right? So I'm almost not fully flexed, but flex the dorsiflexion here, knee flexion, hip flexion, and then when I come up, it's the opposite. So I'm going into plantar flexion because I'm increasing the space here. Then I'm also going to knee extension because I'm extending the knees here, and then I'm also opening up the hips here at the front, which is hip extension. Okay, so what else do we got here? Shoulder protraction, right? Almost all the time, if your shoulders protract, you're going to internally rotate at the shoulder. Now this is kind of easy to forget because, or kind of, I don't say easy to forget, but just something to consider, is that when you're in this position here, what Kelly Starrett calls the douchebag position, not only am I protracted, I'm also internally rotated. They usually go hand in hand. So if someone has bad posture or very tight traps, they'll be internally rotated and shoulder protracted. Now, if I do the opposite, which is retract my shoulder blades completely, seldom will you have somebody have external rotation or internal rotation of the shoulder while being fully retracted. I've seen it before where someone is like almost fully retracted or as retracted as they can get, but then they still have some internal rotation at the shoulder. But typically what happens is when someone retracts their shoulder blades back, they're going to cause external rotation of the shoulder, right? So because it's rotating away from the midline. Protraction, retraction, right? Elevation, depression. Shoulder adduction, shoulder abduction. This is shoulder adduction. There's different forms of adduction. Think about this. You can adduct this way, or abduct, sorry. You can abduction this way, you can abduction this way. They're two movements, and if you think about it, think about bodybuilding, right? When you're going this way, typically more rear delts, mid delt, and then if you go here, this is more front delt and mid delt, right? Depending on the direction of the resistance. Can't forget the biceps. Elbow flexion, right? Elbow extension. Elbow flexion, elbow extension. What flexes the biceps? Or what flexes, well, you flex your bicep, right? See, this is, I think, people who are not been working out for a while or maybe not used to the terminology will get confused. Flex your bicep, flex your tricep, right? So if I'm flexing my tricep, what's happening to my elbow? It's extending, right? Again, one way to remember the difference between flexion and extension. Now, I know this is pretty simple. I think this is, to me, it's a no-brainer. You should be able to know this. But I'm sure there are a few people out there that might confuse the two, elbow flexion and extension. It's simply if this is anatomical position, right? Anatomical position. If you go into flexion, you're going forward. Flexion at the hip. Typically, that's almost always going to be flexion. And if you're moving away, moving behind you, like this, that's typically extension. Only difference is the knee, because when you extend the knee, you're kicking forward, and when you flex the knee, you're kicking backwards. So when I extend the elbow, it flexes the tricep. When I flex the bicep, that flexes the elbow. So elbow flexion, primary function of elbow flexion is the bicep, and then the biceps, and then also you got some of the forearm muscles as well, brachioradialis. And then we have, I think that covers most of it. Hope this video helps you. Maybe a little quick review. That way you can kind of see all the movements. Flexion, extension, lateral flexion, abduction, adduction, abduction. In this case, this is horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction, if you want to be very specific. Then you have lateral flexion of the spine, right? What causes lateral flexion of the spine? Typically, you just kind of feel it, really, right? It's usually the lower back, upper back, well, actually lower back muscles, like the erector spinae, actually typically the QL is probably the big mover, the quadratus labidorum, and then also you got some oblique muscles that also involved with that. Elbow flexion, elbow extension, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension. This is the one I always forget. This is shoulder extension. When the arm is moving away from you, it's moving down. If you've ever done lat pull downs like this, this is shoulder extension. Sometimes people will do this all the way back like this. Extension. Hip extension. At the hip here, you look here. Hip extension. Anyways, hopefully that's helped you. Leave a comment if this helped you. Click like if you haven't already. And subscribe if you're not a subscriber. Thanks for watching.